Indie Coconuts Mans presents
Agnibala.
The Woman of Fire.
A podcast.
Where am I in your world? In your bed? Or in the cages of your temples? A wife, then a goddess you made me. Once your mistress, then an idol. It was my anguish I was burning in, not in the holy flame you turned me in. Kovalan, the son of a very wealthy merchant, married Kannagi, a young woman of legendary beauty. They lived together happily until Kovalan met the dancer Madhavi and fell in love with her. In his infatuation, he forgot Kannagi and gradually spent all his wealth on the dancer. Some scholars even say that he had only come back because he felt cheated by Madhavi and not because of realization that he was wrong. Later in the epic, when Kovalan is falsely accused of stealing Queen's anklets and is executed without trial, Kannagi came to King's court, broke open the anklet, showing it's not the same as the Queen's. Realizing their fault, the king and the queen died of shame. Kannagi takes to the street, marching around the city 3 times, and then finally tearing off her left breast and throwing it on the roofs of the city, asking that the entire city be consumed by fire, and that the only righteous be spared. Agni obliges, and the mighty holy city of Madurai is utterly destroyed. Patriarchy regards female sexuality as a threat to its power and attempts to contain it. Repressed for centuries by patriarchy, women were forced into silence while struggling to use a discourse that was inadequate to express reality fully. When this story was taught in schools a few decades back, the students were taught a chaste woman is all-powerful. Chastity is closely related to the formation of a binary category for women in accordance with the way a woman obeys or disobeys patriarchal value system. Therefore, it has become a truism of patriarchy that representations of women consistently reflect virgin and a whore dichotomy which is dominant in our culture. Therefore, a good woman like Kannagi is chaste, intelligent, and divine, whereas Madhavi is corrupted, foolish, and vicious. What is interesting is that in a men's world, a woman can be a protagonist, but only on the terms of men. It was a man who made her a wife, and it was a man who turned her into a goddess. This is problematic because it does not elevate her position, but it drops her down from basic humanity. Here is a goddess whose identity belongs to her husband, who is brought to the picture when her husband dies and is worshipped because she avenged her adulterous husband's death.
That was rather interesting, Sahiti. And just like fire burning out the way for Kannagi, or just like fire burning out the way, as Pink sang it, Draupadi was also a product of a rather voluptuous fire of rage.
The roots of patriarchy are so deeply set into the story of Draupadi's birth that when her father wished upon a son to avenge him, he was blessed with a daughter instead.
One of the earliest recorded protests against a male dominated world and society, Draupadi's characteristic fight against injustice reflects one of the first acts of feminism, a fight for one's rights, and in this case, her need for unquenchable thirst to avenge the words inflicted on her. Here is a poem I found online that beautifully captures the essence of Draupadi's injustices. It goes something like this. Being shared by 5 men was written in my fate. I was not loved and wed, but a prize for their skill. I never felt belonged, I was just served on a plate you could pass on when you had your fill. I still wonder the way they staked me for dice. Was I a partner for life? A prize or property? Palace stood helpless, witness of the vice. Now they raise a brow, put a mark on my chastity. Yet I hear the stories being told. Kurukshetra was a great war. Draupadi sowed the seed. A woman caused the war. Meaning the men were mellow? No, the war was not due to the injustice served and ego of the clans. No, the war was not due to wronged men and righteous stand. No, the war was due to a woman and her coveted beauty. The war was due to her revenge, which they felt was their duty. The blame lies with me while they are remembered for their virtues. What adds more to this intensely tragic state of events stated in this poem is that all her life, Draupadi had to quietly endure the ignominy of many fleeting references to her multiple husbands. At times, also crudely being bordered on the disgrace of being termed a prostitute, when it was Vyasa, Kunti, and a myriad of patriarchal forces that set her polyandrous marriage into motion. Karna had in fact openly remarked in a crowded assembly that a woman who had more than one husband definitely enjoyed the sport like a prostitute. Furthermore, being gambled away like a commodity after her husband had lost himself, deeming her less of a person than him, and then later left to die like a tramp on the roadside as her husband trekked the Himalayas, Draupadi is always seen succumbing to oppressions. However, Draupadi's soft nature did not render her submissive or soft-spoken. She was the only woman known to have shockingly, for her time, openly insulted the Kuru elders and her husbands. She was, as people call her, a conscious manipulator, reminding her husbands of their flaws, instigating and constantly avenging. Innumerable controversies, uncountable opinions, infinite wars of words, and one name conjured, Draupadi. The kind of woman who stood up naked against patriarchal forces, sealed their lips shut with her words as she said, and I quote, "What is the use of clothes? You can strip me, but how will you clothe me again? Are you a man? There is not a man here I should be ashamed of. I will not let any man put my clothes on me. What more can you do? Come on, count to me. Come on, count to me," says Draupadi in an open court when she is being disrobed, while pushing back Senayak, a Kuru, with her mangled breasts. And for the first time, the men in the court are afraid. Afraid to stand before an unarmed target. Terribly afraid.
I agree, Niraja. If Draupadi was shunned for her candid resolution and daring spunk, then Sita was heralded for her humility, her sacrifice, her allegiance to duty, and her silence. Sita is the ideal daughter, the ideal wife, the ideal woman. Sita is the embodiment of the Nari Dharma, and the greatest of women, who are simply those who don't break the rules of society and lives under the male dominance amicably. Sita was loyal and dedicated. She held her ground and protected her chastity for as long as Ravana imprisoned her. And when the question of her purity became a question of national significance, and when it mattered so much to Rama's reign, she agrees, no, demands, according to some narratives, to do the Agni Pariksha. And regardless of this remarkable verification of purity, when a passing stranger makes a comment about her time in Lanka, she picks up her things and her pregnant belly and puts herself in exile. This is an overindulgence in duty and chastity, and reflects what a lot of us have been asked to be: to accept and sacrifice everything, from our lives to our dignity, to protect the honor of our people and our husbands. What gives a woman value is directly correlated to her obedience, her loyalty and submission to those around her, and the seal between her legs. And when women are asked to be like Sita, There is not a lot of people asking men to be like Ram. Talking about Ram, when Sita was designed as a wife devoted to her wifely duties, Ram seemed to lack most of his husbandly duties. Once a king, his duty to his wife and the mother of his children evaporated. He became a silent spectator who didn't raise a finger to protect the dignity of his wife, who he swore he trusted. So, if she had been touched when in captivity, is that all there is to reduce her worth as a woman? Was she now a salacious woman, impure and unfit? And when Sita sends her sons away back to their father and returns to the mud, she is becoming what the patriarchy wants women to be, a commodity whose value is tied to her use to a man, her faithfulness to a man, her willingness to sacrifice her body, her children, her virtue, her desires, all for the man. But patriarchy is not a men versus women issue. It is merely an ideology that infringes on another's right to live and attempts to justify it with elaborate moral and spiritual ideals. Regardless of the debate whether Sita was a victim or not, she remains being used as a tool to beat other women into sanctioned submission to patriarchy.
That is an interesting point, Ajna. Well, this reminds me of another character who's in the same story, but is quite different from Sita. And that is Kaikeyi, who saved her husband's life in the battlefield and is widely and mostly known as a selfish, arrogant, ruthless woman who caused Ram's exile and later her husband, King Dashrath's death. She was a character in shades of grey, a warm-hearted, complex woman, a gentle, stubborn, arrogant, and a confused woman. Yes, she did care about her son a lot and wanted him to take up the throne. Don't you think any mother would wish their child to be the heir? And Kaikeyi was brave enough to ask for it without caring what the society would think of her. Mantra had her own part to play in feeding onto the insecurities of Kaikeyi. According to some versions of Ramayana, Dashrath promised Kaikeyi's father that he will make her son the next heir of Ayodhya, which clearly didn't happen. And hence this explains that Mantra was simply doing her duty by serving her king, and that is Kaikeyi's father. On the other hand, Kaikeyi lets nothing stop her in safeguarding her son's inheritance. The threat of widowhood, which becomes a reality, the outrage of all of Ayodhya, which turns into the cruel condemnation of all generations to follow. The tragedy of Kaikeyi lies in the rejection of her sacrifice by the very person for whom she went through fire, her son Bharata. Why is Kaikeyi held solely responsible for what happened? Why did no one stand up against her when she demanded her 2 boons, instead of listening helplessly to Kaikeyi as if she was an oracle? For could she not be confused too? What were the other 2 queens doing? What were the ministers and the royal priest doing? Was the personality of Kaikeyi so overwhelming, her hold on the kingdom so unquestioned that no one dared challenge her will till her own son returned to disobey her? No one has an answer to this question. Instead, everyone pointed their fingers to Kaikeyi, the stone-hearted queen who brought disaster to Ayodhya. A woman isn't appreciated when she asks for herself. A woman isn't appreciated when she asks for more. She is instead shunned for being selfish, egocentric, self-centered, and that's how Kaikeyi has become a victim of patriarchy.
As Mona said, Kaikeyi was the victim of patriarchy. Meanwhile, there's a price attached to every transgression, and this is applicable to not only mortals but also to the celestials or the released souls. The Ahalya episode exemplifies the extent of damage that desire and ego wrought upon them. Ahalya is the wife of the sage Gautama Maharishi. Many Hindu scriptures say that she was seduced by Indra, cursed by her husband for infidelity, and liberated from the curse by Ram. Indra disguises himself in her husband's avatar and seduces her. The sage catches them and curses Indra to have 1,000 marks of vaginas on his body and for Ahalya to turn into stone. But Indra, by the help of many gods and his colleagues, converts his curse into ice, while Ahalya remains in the stone form forever and is redeemed when Vishnu visits her as Lord Ram. Throughout, she maintains a stony silence. Ahalya could have asked for her redemption from gods or female gods. The sage did not give her the chance and gave her a lifetime of punishment by making her silent. Ahalya gets married to a sage who is older than her. Didn't the Supreme Creator find it necessary to ask her if she wanted a husband who had been a father figure? She had to live with the old man whose attention was only towards rituals and religion. He never considered Ahalya as his wife. Ahalya perhaps didn't know throughout the incident that it's Indra. Even if she knew who was behind the mask, she would permit it, as a woman is young and needs to fulfill the desire she's craving for. Why is sexual desire considered a sin? This desire is the basis of every desire or emotion. When the owner of the flower neglected its bloom, wasn't it obvious that bees would swoon over this beautiful flower? And in such a state of momentary adulation, if the flower did allow the bee to have its nectar, was this unnatural? Why did Brahma give an intense curse to Ahalya and not to Indra, even though he knew who had started this? Ahalya was punished by a man because she exercised her individuality. Her receiving the sexuality was a threat to the patriarchy. In mythological context, when men can get married to more than one woman, why can't a woman exercise the basic desire? Patriarchal society comes into the notion and condemns Ahalya as a fallen woman. Ahalya, she is what she is, herself. She needs no touch of no holy feet any longer.
That's an interesting point, Vaishnavi. When Pudhumaipithan uses mythology as a genre, he uses it in his portrayal of the mythical women, widows, and prostitutes with emotional events that would inspire debates about traditions and modernity with what these women have been constantly related with, without affirming a social reformist position to which they have been constantly linked to.
Agnibala.
Kannagi, a wife turned goddess. Presented by Sahiti Gonaga, roll number 1831221.
Draupadi as a woman of powerful voice. Presented by Niraja Deshpande. Roll number 1831220.
Sita, the ideal woman, presented by Ajna Sultana, roll number 1831206.
Kaikeyi, presented by Monaswita Nath, roll number 1831218.
Ahalya, who controls others' desires, presented by Vaishnavi Swami, roll number 1831226.